Well, thanks for joining us for this panel. There have been a lot of challenges for the European Union over the last years, from Russia to the Middle East, where crises have impacted or have had an impact on Europe. And we're here to discuss today how those challenges have been perceived in the European Union and how the EU has reacted to them by adapting their security narrative, their security strategy. And maybe before we start with the discussion, let's just start with a short introduction. If we could start with you, Mr. Michelot.
Yes, Martin Michelot. I'm the Deputy Director of EUROPEUM Institute for European Policy. We're very happy to host you here today.
Hello, I'm Petr Drulák. I'm now Czech ambassador to France and to UNESCO. Formerly, I was Deputy Foreign Minister, and before that, I was for many years Professor of International Relations and Director of the Institute of International Relations here in Prague.
Hello, my name is Lina. I work at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute at the Department for European Security.
Hello, I'm Alexandre Escorcia. I'm Deputy Director of Policy Planning in the French Foreign Ministry. And up until a few days ago, I was an advisor to the French Minister for Foreign Affairs.
And I'm Rick Noack. I work as a reporter with the Washington Post in London, and I also cover terrorism and security issues for German television. So maybe before we kind of go into how the European Union has adapted its strategy, let's go back to the origins and why all of this was set in motion. Me working for an American newspaper, obviously, we cover a lot Donald Trump and his statements regarding NATO and Europe, and to us it always seems like that has been the defining issue that has set in motion this process, or the changes in that process. And I'm just wondering, is that correct, or are there other issues, other factors that are equally important or even more important? Maybe starting with you.
Sure. Well, talking about Donald Trump and NATO seems to be incredibly easy, but as a matter of fact, I think there are some layers of complications, some layers that we need to unpeel to understand why Donald Trump and his comments on NATO being obsolete have been less important than they seem. The first thing we need to bear in mind is that when we talk about Donald Trump and NATO, there is the comment about NATO being obsolete. There is the comments about the 2%. But Donald Trump is only amplifying and saying using different rhetoric to express a message that both the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States had used very frequently. And you know, the 2% debate, the burden sharing debate, is just as old as NATO itself. And as a matter of fact, Donald Trump likes to take credit for the fact that European defense budgets have been increasing ever since the beginning of his presidency. But as a matter of fact, they had actually been increasing before his presidency. And not only has there been this defense increase, but there's also been an increase in the amount of cooperative projects that the European Union member states have entered in together, such as, for example, the procurement between the French and the Germans of strategic airlift capabilities, the existence for now almost 20 years of the European Air Transport Command. I mean, there are a certain amount of initiatives that show that the Europeans have been able to be in charge of very small aspects of their security that largely predate Donald Trump's presidency. So I want to be clear about this first fact. The second fact that we need to insist upon is that while Donald Trump may have claimed that NATO was obsolete and eventually walked back the statement last week at a press conference, Donald Trump does not seem to be interested in making the decisions that actually have an impact on the deployment of American troops within in the eastern flank or even in Afghanistan. The decisions about the structures of the armed forces seem to be in the hands of what the Washington Post actually sometimes has called the axis of adults. which is composed of General McMaster at the NSC, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, and Secretary of Defense James Mattis. So I think this should allay the fears of the Europeans, is that the important decisions on American military engagements are largely made outside of the confines of the White House, and we should not be distracted by Donald Trump's tweets.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, you...
Yeah, I agree that I would not overestimate the significance of Trump remarks, because for me the recent momentum in European security is another milestone in the European maturity, and getting mature is a long-term process. So if we go back a few years, if we look at this process from a distance, and I just look at the recent history, we see Saint-Malo, which is the late 1990s, which is Chirac and Blair, making important initiatives in the European, for making Europe actually more full-fledged and more autonomous. Then we have actually the first EU security strategy after the invasion of Iraq in 2004. So step by step, Europe is getting more mature, and getting more mature means creating a full-fledged political community which is able to take care of itself. It does not mean that the NATO is dead, that it is over. NATO is important, will still be part of the game. But on the other hand, this growing awareness that Europeans cannot depend on everything, in every aspect of their security on the United States, that has been in Europe for some time. And maturity means that throughout the years we are able actually to develop more and more steps to make it real. Sometimes, when we get a wake-up call from beyond Atlantic, can be helpful, like it was the Yugoslav war in the late 1990s, where Europe actually saw that it's completely unable to do anything, and then Chirac and Blair started an important initiative. Another wake-up call was Iraq crisis. So for me, President Trump's remarks are another wake-up call in the series of our growing more mature, us in Europe.
And you probably have a very Scandinavian approach as well to that.
Sure. Well, I agree with both of you. I think definitely the election of Trump as president and also his appearance at the first NATO meeting plays a role, but also that CSDP has been a very long-term ambitions of the EU member states, of the European Union, of closer cooperation on defense issues. But to me, I think it's the changing security environment in Europe and a changing public opinion that has really put security issues on top of the agenda. The conflict in Ukraine, of course, war in Syria, the refugee crisis, violent extremism and terrorist attacks on Europe. So if you compare the European security strategy from 2003, the way the EU defined security in 2003, it was all about external policy. It was about the EU as a security actor out there in the world, making the world a safer place. When you look at the global strategy from last year, it's all about making the EU a safe place. It's all about internal security. So even when the EU is out in training missions or in capacity building functions, it is to stabilize neighboring countries, for example, for the benefit of the European Union citizens. And I think it's both a change in the actual change in the security environment and the security conditions. We do face more insecurities today. But it's also a momentum thanks to shifting public opinion that was sort of very difficult to put any of these issues in terms of that will cost a lot of money, investments during or directly after the financial crisis, where public opinion was very much focused on issues of economic or job security, economic recovery. And now we have this momentum really to focus on security issues. And I guess Brexit will also come up for later in the discussions, that whether that has impacted the European discourse on closer security cooperation. But to me, it's really these, the changing narratives is really based on changing security conditions, changing public opinion. And the question now is, what CSDP could actually accomplish in terms of meeting these new security challenges, the way they have been identified and defined by the public.
You just mentioned Brexit. Maybe a French response, is that helping France to assume a bigger leadership role even when it comes to the military in Europe?
Well, I agree with a lot of what has been said about the analysis of why we are where we are, which is having kind of what I would call a European defense and security moment. We've had those before, so we know that they come and go, but for the reasons that were mentioned, I think this one is here to stay, and there may be something of a paradigm shift with the way Europeans think about their own security. And of course, that has to do with, as you said, the threats getting closer and closer to Europe, both internal and external threat posed by terrorism, and of course the state of our neighborhood, which is arguably both one of the big strategic failures of the European Union in the past years, not entirely of its own making, although partly, you could argue, and also a wake-up call and a call for action and for more defense and security involvement by Europeans also in their own neighborhood. I agree completely with the fact that the discourse by Americans, albeit a little bit more diplomatic, has been the same for years, if not decades. Europe needs to step up in terms of its defense. So now we're being treated to a more robust version in the form of that discourse, but the actual concern by the United States is the same. However, I do not think that we should, and we will, because I think we will, step up to the plate only because the United States wants it or demands it, but because it really is a necessity and one that is increasingly felt by our public opinions. It's also favored by the evolution in a few member states, which is an interesting one. Of course, in Great Britain, it's a little bit particular because I think as they move away and as they exit the European Union, they will very much want to keep, and I think we will have an interest in that too, the security partnerships, not only the bilateral ones, and the Franco-British bilateral cooperation in defense area is extremely rich and promising, but also the partnership with the European Union as a security provider. But there is also an interesting evolution in Germany in the past few years that you have been able to observe, away a little bit from restraint, from a more guarded position towards an idea of being able to take more responsibility. But even arguably in countries like the Czech Republic, I was discussing before this meeting with fellow policy planners in the Czech Foreign Ministry, and they were talking about a shift in mentalities a little bit in the Czech Republic, away from a NATO-only security policy, and, as the ambassador said, recognizing the need for Europeans to take action, to take matters in their own hands. I would add, however, and we'll get more into detail on this, I'm sure, but that the proposals that are now being put forward, and especially the ones that have to do with financing and the European defense industrial base, profit to Europeans, to member states, and profit to NATO, since it's all about increasing the defense efforts and ultimately increasing the way we handle the famous single set of forces that we can use in the different frameworks.
It's interesting how you talked about what has changed over the last years. Maybe from your perspective, what has been the most significant change, really, over the last years when it comes to EU defense, EU strategy?
Well, I want to give you a very simple answer and tell you that, as a matter of fact, Brexit has liberated consciences and has also liberated the European Union from one of the items that actually blocked the progress of further capacities or further capabilities given to the European Union. The United Kingdom, and that's not a negative statement, had in most cases opposed any further competences given to the European Union in order to enhance its security structures. So as a matter of fact, you know, the Brexit has allowed lots of countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain in the first place, to dust off the covers of the old plans that had been put forward in the past, and actually to now very quickly move forward on them. The most recent example is the fact that the European leaders agreed just a couple weeks ago on the creation of what some call a mini headquarter, which is called in Brussels language the multi-planning capability and conduct headquarters, which allows for the planning of non-executive military missions. So the existence of this mini headquarters is a first progress that was allowed by the fact that the British have lifted the reluctance for the European Union to play a stronger role, and this is only the first domino that is falling. There will be many others, and the Commission has announced them in a reflection paper that was published last week, and the European leaders will continue to debate on them. There is now a real political incentive, a political moment, as Monsieur Escorcia said, for further cooperation on the improvement of the European defense and technological industrial basis. There is a preparatory act that is put out for improving the capabilities of European defense industries to improve the research and development capabilities. I mean, there are many dominoes that will fall into place and that have been partly enabled by the fact that the biggest domino fell, and that was the reluctance of the United Kingdom, and that really led to a coalition of the willing, but that coalition of the willing is actually 27 at this point.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the role of Central European countries and what role they have played pushing forward exactly that strategy which you have just described.
Well, I think what I see as especially promising with the initiatives for European security or for a deeper European security is that this topic doesn't seem to be as divisive as other projects or initiatives for more integration, because everybody in Europe agrees that that's something which has been neglected in the past, that's something which Europe needs to do, and that Europe needs to invest into that. So it seems to me that that's very favorable, because, I mean, if you look at the European debates about the further direction of integration or about the big important issues of Europe, in the past 5-6 years we had like two big things. One was the financial crisis, which divided the south of Europe against the north of Europe. Then we had the migration crisis, dividing some of the new member states against some of the old member states. So we had this experience of recent divisions, and now we have the topic on which I think everyone can agree and to which everyone can contribute. So that's and I find this very important from the Central European perspective, because when we talk about Europe, it really should be Europe of 27 or of all the regions, north, south, east, west, because if we focus just on one part of the Europe, it's not Europe. It's just an important regional group and nothing more. So in this respect, we have a truly European project which can have tangible benefits and which is likely to have a real legitimacy. So that's what I find promising about the European security, about Europe of defense or Europe of security.
Mm. And you have, I mean, when we talk about security, we often think about defense, but you've looked into other aspects also that are relevant and actually do have an impact on the EU security strategy that are far different and actually relate to something you've just mentioned, the refugee crisis, right? So what is that, how has that kind of shaped the EU's approach or even understanding of the challenges they face?
I think it's very well reflected in the global strategy. It's a very ambitious document. It's very broad. It covers a lot of issues. So it has sort of a contemporary take on security rather than a typical traditional military framing of security. But they keep coming back to the role CSDP, so the Common Security and Defense Policy, will play in meeting these challenges. So even though the EU put forward a comprehensive definition of security and security challenges, and also some of the tools, what has got most attention, I think that's exactly for this reason. There is a lot of, there are almost consensus about taking defense aspect forward, is to develop a closer cooperation on defense issues. And what I think there is a mismatch here in the narrative. On the one hand, we talk about maybe in the EU-Turkey agreement failing and hundreds of thousands of people in a very short period of time will come to Europe. What is CSDP going to do about that? Even if we implement CSDP perfectly, exactly how is that going to solve refugee crisis on the Greek islands, for example? The CSDP in the Lisbon Treaty is meant for missions outside, in countries outside of the EU. So how is that going to deal with refugee crisis inside of the EU? And of course, you could argue that there is some convergence with Operation Sophia, for example, the Mediterranean mission to fight illegal migration, partly, that you can imagine that kind of mission. But it's how many people have they actually stopped reaching the EU, and it's very, very small, the impact on the overall migration flows to the EU. So I think even though the strategic objective is there and the strategy is in place, and I think I'm actually quite positive to the traction that the defense component has had. It's the first time in the past year we've seen a lot of developments within this field, more than we've had for the past 10 or 15 years. So there is a lot of movement, and I think it's positive, but I also think we should keep in mind on some of these contemporary security issues that Europeans are worried about, that limit that CSDP, even a perfectly implemented one, and then we're not talking about a half-implemented or not at all implemented CSDP, what they could actually do in terms of meeting the contemporary security challenges. So I'm a little torn on the effectiveness of the future. Yeah.
It ties a little bit into the question which just appeared on the screen there from one of you. Do we really need security cooperation on the EU level when we have NATO? Whoever wants to come up with an answer.
I would like to answer some of those questions because they're really interesting and they go to some of the core issues in this area. But I'd like to pick up a little bit on the refugee issue as well, because you said, and it's absolutely true, that CSDP is not the only or even arguably the most adequate tool because of its institutional limitations to deal with this. However, what we have seen is the EU as a whole being able to put instruments to the fore, political instruments, the dialogue with Turkey, instruments, operational instruments within its waters through the Frontex mission, and a little bit of CSDP, and in order to try to fight this phenomenon. And arguably the political dialogue with Turkey and the accord has been the most successful, but the others shouldn't be neglected either, the hotspots and all the rest of it. And I think this actually points to a really good example of, because it goes to answering the NATO piece, of what the EU can bring to bear, which is a real added value, which is the combination of different instruments that the EU has at its disposal that other organizations may not have. That is to say, the political piece of dialogue, the development aid and peace, humanitarian aid and all the other instruments, the capacity building in civilian and military areas of CSDP, and also all the different instruments such as Frontex when you talk about the protection of our common borders. So there you have a whole gamut of instruments and a toolbox that really sets the EU apart from any other organization that you can speak of, and that really speaks to the complementarity that needs to appear, and that's actually the answer to the question, between the EU and these other organizations when you talk about fighting any of those security challenges or threats. And I think really the way of building up this toolbox of the EU in all its different domains is really the way to go in the future, and we've started to do that, arguably in a smaller scale than maybe is required, but we've started to do that in the area of the refugees. And if I may, I would like to pick up on the issue on the common EU army, because I think that's a very interesting one as well. It is at least not French position that we would advocate what would be called a European army, at least not in the sense of an army that would supersede national armies and take their place. I think the way the question is framed is extremely relevant, because it is about who are you and in which conditions are you willing to pay the price of blood. This comes to the heart of sovereignty, even though in CSDP and other settings, so we've been sending peacekeepers into the UN or contributions to CSDP missions where sometimes it has become dangerous and sometimes we've had to pay that price in NATO context as well. Indeed, I think we are not politically ready to jump into a European army that would supersede existing armies. Because that would also require a degree of integration of our security policies writ large and even of our parliamentary procedures that is just not there. But what we can and should aim at in the short to medium term is more defense integration so that we have more projects together and more forces together. And I agree with the EU ideas of revamping the battle groups or having more efficient EU multinational forces so that we prepare the ground for if the political evolution in the longer term allows it, making more progress towards an EU army or a European army.
Do you want to respond?
If I may pick up on some of the excellent points that were just made, I think that first and foremost we need to remember that the deepening of EU cooperation largely came in the first place is a way to keep Europe united after the extremely strong shock of Brexit. The first ideas came out literally just a couple days after the results of Brexit. So first and foremost, this is a project to keep the European political integration alive. But picking up on that question of do we really need security cooperation at the EU level when we have NATO? Well, I think we cannot answer this question without understanding the change role of the United States in the minds of a lot of Europeans. There is this notion that the European Union shares lots of common security threats that we may not want to share with the United States or that the United States may not want to share with us. And there is this desire that is very clearly expressed, especially by the French government, to be able to act alone, autonomously, to be able to act quickly, and to be able to act efficiently to respond to a situation that may endanger either French or European security. And I think what is behind this fundamental progress in EU security cooperation is this ability and necessity at this point to be able to act autonomously. And this is why the European Union global strategy erects this idea of strategic autonomy is the most important priority. And the follow-up of the European Union global strategy is actually the implementation of the strategic autonomy. And what does that mean? That means that in at least until 2024, there will be equipment projects which are allowed to enable the European Union member states to have the capabilities in order to carry out these operations, these peacekeeping operations, these crisis management operations, the protection of the European territory that will allow to protect the citizens without necessarily having to need the United States. Just one example, which will speak very, very clearly, is that when the French started their operation in Mali 3 years ago now, in order to carry out the airlift missions that were required to get the French troops, the French capabilities on the ground. The French were able to do a little bit of this, but they also needed to rent fly-in hours from American capabilities, and they needed to rent fly-in hours from Ukrainian strategic airlift capabilities. So the idea is that in order to carry out a mission that is destined to protect European interests and to protect European citizens, the Europeans should be able to carry it out themselves. And that does not mean the duplication of NATO structures. It means that the two organizations can both carry out missions efficiently. And just a final word on this, any progress that is made in terms of the capabilities of the European member states directly also enhances the ability of NATO to act. Because we're not talking about competition between the two organizations. There is, as a matter of fact, an interinstitutional agreement that was signed last year that has 42 very clear points on cooperation. So I think that we should stop artificially opposing the EU and NATO, that the two organizations have will both be competitive and have complementary missions that will not mean a common EU army or a common NATO army anytime soon.
So everyone agrees that NATO and the EU kind of complement each other?
Yeah, I think it's a number of years ago, some people actually, even in this country and elsewhere, saw it as an either-or choice, either European security or the NATO, you have to choose. I think this has never been the case, even at that time, and it is not the case today. So there is a lot of complementarity, and the exact nature of this complementarity will depend actually on the development of the European capabilities, on the NATO capabilities. But there is actually one area where I think NATO will stay irreplaceable, where it's actually quite difficult to imagine anything on the European level right now or in the mid-term, not just in short term, but also in the mid-run, and that is nuclear deterrence, because having American security guarantee means actually having behind you someone with actually the most impressive nuclear deterrence in the world. And that's something which is like the ultimate security guarantee. And of course, once you lose it, or once this would be put into the doubt, which is not the case, but if it happened, then it would actually put into the doubt the whole non-proliferation regime, because that would be an incentive for some countries to develop their own nuclear capabilities. So in this respect, I think this NATO link between nuclear deterrence of the United States and European territory in territorial defense, that's something which is irreplaceable, and it's something which which is like the ultimate core identity of the NATO. Besides that, NATO has, of course, many other goals and missions. Speaking about other questions, I think there was this idea about European, which just disappeared, I think. There was this about common cooperation, European integration in internal security inside, and I think this is really not the question, not so much the question for defense forces, for army. It's really about police and intelligence services. And where I see actually the really big obstacle, something which is not easy to overcome, is the secretive administrative culture of these organizations, especially of intelligence services. These are not services which are really ready to share the information they have. They are unwilling to share them even in the national system with other agencies. And cross-national sharing at the European level is even more sensitive. So in this respect, I think it's necessary, but it will require a lot of actually pressure and a lot of political steps to have a culture of much more of sharing the information and sharing the assets, because asset sharing is also important for military cooperation. But in the area of internal security, police, intelligence services, sharing is something where I think we have not really advanced that much yet.
And one thing that's often thrown around in this context is the idea of like a European army. Is that a total misconception, or is there some truth to that?
Well, if I made that to the European army, well, I think it can be seen like a sort of the ultimate goal, something which may come if we take all these steps which are looming now. But that's not like the mid-term goal. That's not short-term goal. That's not mid-term goal. So when there is a question about casualties at a mission, and I think Alexander has already reacted to that, it's quite clear that in the years to come, the soldiers who will be sent to foreign missions will be sent by their governments, by national governments and their national parliaments. It can be within the framework of a European operation, but the ultimate political responsibility will not be at the European level, but it will be at the national level. So you can call it a European army, but it's a metaphor. It's sort of a metaphor, because it's a European army, but the responsibility for the expedition, for sending out these people will stay for years to come with the national parliaments and governments.
Absolutely.
Do you want to?
I talked to this a little bit, and I have little to add to what the ambassador said. Indeed, if it can be a useful rallying cry, it may be something of value, provided that we know what we put behind it and we're not in any misconception, because that's also important. I would like to come to, maybe, if you allow, to some of these questions, because I think they're really interesting. Not that yours aren't. The one about human rights and employment, youth dialogue as challenges. Yes, all of these are challenges. Some of them have to do, or could go some way towards explaining some of the security challenges that we face, such as terrorism. If you know, that's a little bit an area where we still need some, I guess, some more research and some more discussion as to the causes of terrorism. But you can say that at least disenfranchised youth in some of our suburbs can cause people to turn or to radicalize. That's a matter of debate. But I think we really need to be a little bit clear-eyed about the real security threats and challenges that we have out there, not to diminish these other challenges, which are more societal challenges. The wars in the Middle East, the destabilization of our eastern neighborhood, the proliferation challenges. Ambassador mentioned nuclear deterrence. Frankly, what we have coming out of North Korea at the moment is extremely worrying, and even though it's far from our shores, we think it poses a direct security challenge to Europe and to Europeans. And so, frankly, those need to be addressed without diminishing the importance of all these other issues, and also as a comprehensive package. But it would be a little reckless to not address those security challenges as well. And as to the issue of, I just want to do the one about the defense budget surveillance, because as you know, what we have right now is various incentives or more prescriptive programs for states to do more in their own defense and to plug their capability gaps. In NATO, we have the NATO defense planning process, and in the EU, we also have a capability development process, which is now also flanked by the so-called Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, the CARD. And I think that could be more of an instrument of peer pressure, because it's basically what it could amount to be, in order to bring Europeans to know better what everyone has and what everyone lacks as a consolidated picture, and B, where efforts could be made either nationally or through multinational groupings in order to address capability shortfalls. And this can be done and should be done in complementarity with the processes in NATO, because no one wants to work twice. But in terms of instruments of peer pressure, and also, frankly, of providing justification also for national debates, in order to be able to say to national publics, we're also doing this because we need to show our partners that we're serious about these commitments we're entering into. Those can be interesting tools, and I'm looking forward to seeing the deployment of that also in the UN, together with the evolution of the NATO defense planning process as well.
You want to sure. Just to build on this excellent question. Well, if the 3% deficit rule doesn't work, what sort of punitive mechanisms do we have in order to make the 2% work? And just, of course, the arbitrary 2% metric as of itself is one that is certainly worth a couple more conversations as to whether it is the right one. But I think the question that this asks, and that maybe even NATO may be uneasy with, is the sheer meaning of what getting to 2% means, or what it entails. It means until 2024, when the NATO allies are supposed to realize the 2% pledge. That means almost 900 billion euros in spending. That means that our armed forces must be ready, must have plans in place in order to have this absorption capacity. And at the level of the German armed forces, for example, this entails not only huge issues for the absorption capacity of the army, but that also entails huge societal challenges that I do not know whether countries' politicians are ready to act upon, or ready to decisively change. So I would be wary a little bit of the fact that the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, or even the Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment may actually act as, have a good cop, bad cop sort of show, doing a road show in the 29 capitals of the Allies. and telling them, show me the money, show me your budget for the next 4 years, and how there will be, a price point increase of the spending on defense. So it's a very good question, but I think it raises some of the challenges that go more towards discussions with the chiefs of defense to see how they actually see, what they want in their kit. And it's also a question for the defense industry. I think the simple question is the defense industry ready over the next 7 to 8 years to provide kit that corresponds to the strategic priorities that we want to carry out, the strategic challenges we have to answer. And I think the last question is that's extremely relevant for all of our societies, and it goes a bit to this question about human rights and employment, is will we have enough soldiers, trained officers to carry out the missions that we have to set out sail for? I'll take an example from the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic has often expressed the desire to participate more strongly in missions in Africa. But there's a very simple thing. They do not have enough officers who are trained to speak in French. And if we talk about missions in Africa, this certainly is extremely important. So there are lots and lots of issues that to be considered that will be our daily bread in the next few years.
You mentioned the Czech example.
I think on this NATO EU, but it seems to me that you cannot have EU-style things within the NATO, because the two organizations are profoundly different. Because NATO is consensus-based, really intergovernmental organization, whereas in the EU you have actually the machinery which is able actually to enforce the rules which no other organization can do. So with respect to this, I think this would not be realistic. You can rely on peer pressure, on some sorts of peer pressure, but and developing on what Martin said, I think it's also important really not to get carried away by these quantitative targets, because it's good to have quantitative targets. They are understandable, they are easy to communicate, but it seems to me that one of the greatest challenge to European security is not that not enough money is spent, but the money is spent badly. And if you look at this recent paper of the European Commission about European defense, one of the most impressive things is actually this very graphic illustration comparing European Union and United States with respect to spending. And you see that USA spent indeed more than European Union on defense, but it is twice and a half as much. But no one would claim that the United States have just twice and a half stronger capabilities than European Union. Of course, they are much, much stronger. So the problem is, the main problem is that Europe actually spends the money in a way which is completely inefficient. And again, the paper of the Commission explains what the problem is. So that's the first thing. We need to really have more integration in spending, which means many things, which means a lot of things. So that's I think important. And another thing, when we talk about spending, and it's linked with the second question about human rights, unemployment, etc., with so-called soft issues, I think we should, when we talk about investment into security, we also, it's linked with the question of our responsibility for the world, because many of these missions are not really about our own territorial defense. It's when Europe did something in Libya or in Mali or in Middle East, it's not really territorial defense of European territory in a narrow sense. It's about stability of the neighborhood, stabilization of the neighborhood. So we invest into our security and we want to develop European security to be able to have a stable neighborhood. But having a stable neighborhood does not mean just that you invest into military capabilities. You have development aid and all other issues which need to be invested into. So when we talk about quantitative targets, I see them always linked with all other efforts for the stabilization of our neighborhood, and they should be actually considered together. It's not just about sending soldiers somewhere, it's also about contributing in other ways to the stability of the countries which are in our neighborhood.
Maybe before we open up to your questions, let's get to this one question that's now disappeared about migrants and whether the EU should take more responsibility in trying to use its armies to stabilize countries outside of Europe to prevent migrant influxes, which is something that's actually been discussed quite a lot during the so-called refugee crisis. Is that something that is even relevant in this context?
So I think I agree with the statement that we don't have an EU army, and I don't think that we will have one, not in the foreseeable future anyway. And then there is the definition of what is a migrant. Most of my colleagues at CIPRI are migrants. Our economies are completely dependent on migration. There is very few countries in the EU, or even the EU as a project, is about these outward-oriented states. So these inward-oriented states, or inward-looking states, and closing borders and rise of nationalism, of course, those forces are in Europe. But on the whole, I think migration, many of us agree that migration is good for our own economies, and we're even dependent on it. Then there are aspects of migration, namely these conflict-forced migration out of fragile and dangerous places that we see. So majority of the world's refugees, for example, are these kinds of refugees. So to say that it's all about migration, which is something like 250 million, it's not exactly correct. So I would narrow it down to refugees, and what CSDP could then do to enhance resilience and decrease fragility in countries. This is, of course, in the strategic vision of what CSDP should do and what the missions should be for. For example, the training and capacity building component. So I think the ideas are there, and I'm not completely critical, but for example, just an example of the Libya training and capacity building of border management in Libya to prevent people from fleeing to Europe from Libya. Libya is a transit country, so most of the people in Libya are coming from elsewhere and living under extremely, extremely bad conditions. The EU exported small arms, light weapons to equip, of course, the border security in Libya. That was then stolen immediately on arrival in Libya. So to what extent has that kind of mission then enhanced European security? So I think it's so complex, and whether, even though the intention is good, and I mean, now you might think that it might not was such a thought through idea to send weapons to Libya, given that there is no authority really to control for it. But on the other hand, if you're dealing with training and capacity building of either law enforcement or security sector reform, military border control, it's very difficult not to include equipment in that, and not include military equipment in that equation. So I think what we've seen so far, it's very limited of what we can do. We could probably do more. And I think there's even a risk of being counterproductive. But I think on migration, I don't think that we even have an issue. I think we should talk about this vulnerable migration, migration that people who would prefer not to even leave their home country, like Syrians. They would, of course, prefer to stay in Syria. What can we do to build resilience in countries like Afghanistan? Yeah, I had another point, but I don't remember it right now.
That's fine. Unless somebody wants to respond directly to that, I'd say let's open for questions.
I still had a couple that were interesting as well. I wouldn't want to not mention cyber, especially since there was a question. And cyber, and of course, in the broader, I guess, informational arena question, with what we've had and what we've observed in our electoral campaigns, particularly in France, but also in other countries, but I can speak a little bit for France. What we have observed is indeed an effort that has several dimensions. There's an informational dimension, informational or disinformational, should I say. There is a cyber dimension that has two prongs. One is the hacking of campaigns or certain websites in order to either paralyze them or more frequently to extract information that then can be compromising. And then there's the spreading of so-called fake news and others on the internet for political purposes. And I think what we've seen is really a concerted effort along all those lines. I will not attribute, but certainly there are a certain amount of strong presumptions where those could come from, in order to destabilize our political campaigns and our processes, our democratic processes. I think what we found, at least in the French case, is that our system has been resilient and we've been able to overcome those, and that those efforts and those attempts have not either significantly altered the course of the election or changed the way people voted. But I think we still need to be vigilant, and that is probably an area in which the EU can and should do more. I know there's an effort, including at the European External Action Service, in this area, and I think that's really a growth industry, because these kinds of tactics and attempts are here to stay. I don't think we will see the end of it in the near future. I think each campaign now is going to have that dimension, and I think there are ways of countering these things with several components. I can't go into the details, but there is a strong declaratory component which we deployed, also a technical/forensic component, a legal part, and of course the information arena, which belongs mostly to the free expression of free press and serious journalism, in which the state intervenes less. But that's more of a global strategy that we need, and I think that's an area in which really the EU needs to step up its game in the months and years to come. Just a little word on the security threats and the common assessment, because there was a question out there, and I think it's a fundamental question. How can we advance in our common foreign policy and common security policy if we don't have a shared security assessment of the threats and challenges out there? It is indeed the big question for the EU, but also for other organizations, but peculiarly for the EU. And I think the latest attempts at bridging that gap, be it the EU global strategy or the defense action plan, have indeed tried to pick up what constitute minimum consensus elements among member states about the threats that we collectively face, in order to try to devise common strategies for those. But I think we're going to have to accept for a while here that some threats are felt more urgently and more acutely in some member states, and some others are felt, different ones are felt in other member states. And what we need to do is to have a baseline where we trust each other enough. It's an issue of trust, I think, too, where when a member state says, this is important to me, then the others help it within means, capabilities, and all of that, in order to counter these threats, and then, of course, expect the corresponding solidarity when they face threats that may be less acute to a member state. So I think it boils down also to an issue of trust.
Okay, we only have 5 to 10 minutes left, so I know you wanted to say something.
I would just say a few words about this important question about the Western Balkans, because we have not mentioned it. I think we have not mentioned it, or we mentioned it implicitly when we talked about the neighborhood of the European Union, and we didn't focus on it because we talked about the regions where we have open conflicts, like Ukraine, Syria, or Libya. But of course, the Western Balkan is really essential. And it's also one of these regions which show that you have a period where military intervention is needed, where you have to really invest into military means, and then what follows is actually the period which is actually even more challenging, of the transition to peace and of building modern democratic societies. And some of those countries in the Western Balkans are quite advanced. Some of them are actually in a very bad shape today. So that's exactly the challenge, which is also a security challenge in a broader terms, because according to the French immigration statistics, one of the strongest nationality of immigrants in recent years was actually from Albania. It was not really from Syria or from Iraq, it was Albania, from Western Balkans. So in this respect, the stabilization of the Western Balkans, but today we talk about by non-military means, it's by development assistance, by the help with the transition, is essential. And it's one of the actually goals which the European Union is doing rather well, actually. It was doing rather well in Central and Eastern Europe, and can do, I believe it can do in the Western Balkans. However, it should not send wrong signals to the Western Balkans, like unfortunately the President of the Commission Juncker did at the beginning of his mandate when he said that the no enlargement will be under his tenure, which was probably true, but by saying it so openly, it was rather discouraging for the countries in the Western Balkans. And this European motivation is something which is really helpful and which actually helped to overcome many of the problems they have.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two quick questions, if you want to start.
My name is Ivo Kaplan, and I have one question. How you see this special French-English, French-United Kingdom agreements and this in theoretical struggle for the common security and defense policy? Because this all steps on that Lancaster agreement, also that agreement from 2016, it's going very well, and so how it will be now in this new Brexit atmosphere? Thank you.
Thank you. I mentioned a little bit that the cooperation between France and the UK in the security and defense areas is strong. It's been very strong and structurally so for a few years now, at least since the Lancaster House Agreement, so that's dating back to 2010, but indeed it has been reinforcing itself. And it was indeed conceived as a way of linking our destinies in a way that, of course, makes it easier to do if the partners are both in the European Union. And it's true that it was conceived as a partnership, as a strong bilateral partnership within the European Union, that's without question. However, the fact of the UK exiting the EU does not directly affect the various strands of work that are agreed on, because those are bilateral, be it the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, the capability development projects, or the nuclear area, which all will continue and will reinforce. However, it does pose a political challenge. That is, I think, significant. What we've seen from our British friends in the months since, and the year now, almost since the Brexit referendum result, has been a strong willingness to continue and deepen our strategic bilateral partnership. And I think a realization on their part that in order to do that, we need to find as well some kind of link between the UK and the EU as we move forward. Now, the tricky part about this is that we are very much of the opinion that, and this is not only valid for the EU security and defense area, but for the whole of the future relationship between the EU and the UK, that cannot be negotiated before the modalities of Brexit and of the application of Article 50 are agreed. That was a position that was reaffirmed by Michel Barnier recently, and that is entirely the French position. So that presents us with somewhat of a practical challenge, you know, because that means that in practical terms we cannot agree on the future modalities of association of UK to CSDP or to European security and defense policy writ large before we've figured out all the Brexit negotiation things. However, our bilateral partnership in security and defense will continue to deepen in the meantime. What we think is that since we have that strong political will to continue the bilateral partnership, but also to find ways when the time comes to preserve strong links between the UK and the EU in the area of defense, in the end it will all work out okay, but I think we'll have somewhat of a managing issue, which will be more of a timing issue than a real political problem as I see it for now.
Yeah, just a quick couple of words after this brilliant institutional explanation of the continuation of the French-UK relationship. I think that we need to look at the fact that the two countries have a very similar strategic culture and are the two countries in the European Union still that have the closest thing to a full spectrum force. And that means that the two countries, when there is a given situation that requires a quick and efficient answer, have close enough a strategic culture and have the capabilities to do so together to the extent that the European Union still cannot. And I think that if there is a European response that is needed, the very good relationship between France and the United Kingdom the relationship will continue to be good, and the ability to act together will continue to exist. That being said, I think there's one thing that I would highlight that also perhaps is an opportunity for regions such as Central Europe, is that the French-British cooperation was very much linked to industrial issues. And there are a few common projects that existed, especially the development of an unmanned aerial vehicle platform that existed at the French-British level, and because lots of the seed financing for these projects will perhaps now come from the European Union, the aspect of the French-British relationship that may be harmed is actually the industrial cooperation, because the financing will disappear in part for the British side. So for Central European companies, this may actually be an interesting avenue to apply for funds, apply for grants, and that may also be one of the bases of a closer connection with France in the future.
Okay. Is there one more question, or if not, then I'd say we're running out of time.
I would just take 30 seconds to address the one about Russian encirclement, fear of encirclement, because that's a question that often comes, and frankly, it's enough to look at a map to see that it would be quite an endeavor to encircle Russia. Just look at a map of Russia, and it's very much Eurasian country. However, and this is an important question, not the European army bit, because that I think we've dealt with, but indeed, Jean-Claude Juncker, when in his interview to the German press a couple of years back, when he said that we should move towards a European army, he cited Russia. If you remember, he said we should do this also to show Moscow and to show Putin that we're serious. I would not completely put it that way, but I do think that if you put it positively, and a stronger EU and a stronger security and defense EU that is able to be a player for its own security and defense can also be a stabilizing factor vis-à-vis its neighborhood. And as a complement to NATO, NATO will of course continue to provide not encirclement, but collective defense guarantees to all its members, and particularly to those who fear threatened in the eastern flanks of the alliance. But I think the EU as a strong security provider can also play its role and be an important player in order to show as well political resolve. And in that way, maybe Jean-Claude Juncker was onto something, even though, again, I wouldn't make his words mine entirely.
All right. Well, thank you for all those important insights.